Yes, good morning. My name is Ernie Kleiman and I run stringtown.biz. And if you're interested, we can always be reached at www.stringtown.biz, and I will be more than happy to answer your questions if you have any questions about honing angles or primary grinding angles. So the purpose of my talk today is I'm going to do a little demonstration, I'm going to do a little bit of talking, and do a little bit of showing. And what I'm going to be primarily talking about is how I've been doing things for the past 40 to 45 years in terms of grinding my plane blades and matching them to the material that I'm going to be using. And equally important, in my opinion, which is not discussed by a lot of people, because they're not luthiers, they're basically woodworkers, is to match the honing angle of your blade to the material you're working on. You don't want the same kind of angle on your blade that you're using for rosewood as you are on, let's say, western red cedar or spruce or fir or some other type of softwood. So let's get into it. So on the first demonstration over here, I've got a little plane, and it's basically an old Stanley 220 block plane. It's a large block plane, but as you can see over here, I don't know if camera can show it or not, I bought a new blade, and the primary angle, the grinding angle on this blade is 25 degrees. There's a secondary angle of 35 degrees. And the reason I put the secondary honing angle of 35 degrees on there is I find that the blade lasts a lot longer. And I got the idea for that from the Gordon Gillette book, and I think it works really, really well for certain types of extreme hardwoods like ebony and rosewood and oak and some of the other really, really hard woods that are difficult to plane at best. And here's another example of the same blade that's used. This is an older version of the same blade for the Stanley 220. And if you look carefully, it basically just has a primary 20 degree bevel, 20 degree grinding angle with a secondary 25 degree honing angle. Now I use this blade primarily for cutting softwoods like, again, pine, cedar, fir, etc. And so I've got a whole collection of planes and blades here, and I'm going to be showing different uses for the different blades. For example, here is a blade from a Lie-Nielsen low angle jack plane. And if you look carefully, it's got a really thick blade, and this one has a large bevel angle, primarily angle of 25 degrees and a secondary angle of 35 degrees on it right here. And the gauge that I use is this one over here. I use this little gauge in conjunction with my Lie-Nielsen roller jig over here to set the angles. So I will, for instance, for this one over here as an example, I will put the blade in here like this and set it up very carefully, and then I'll line up the distance. Oops, hold on a second here. I'm getting very far this morning. Okay. And basically I set it up over here, and then I use that gap, the distance between that gap as an indicator of where my 35 degree secondary bevel will be. And I basically use this same jig, which I got the idea from Lie-Nielsen. I think it might be on one of their websites, to set the honing angle, right, the final honing angle on all my plane blades. And then I've got an older honing jig, an Eclipse that's at least 40 years old. The only problem with it doesn't hold chisels and plane blades very well. So as you can see, maybe you can see it in the video, maybe not, I flattened the face over here and put a bevel angle in here to be able to hold the blade. And the bevel angles are marked over here. So there's 38 millimeters for 30 degrees, 50 millimeters for 25 degrees. And that's for your plane irons. And there's a separate one for your chisels. And here's another one that I use once in a while, but not very often. It's from Veritas, which is Lee Valley, and it's basically good for odd-sized chisels and so on and so forth, and plane blades. that I cannot get into either this one or the Lie-Nielsen one. And also it has two little notches on it that you can change, so you can get your primary bevel on it, and then you can get your secondary honing angle by just pulling this little knob out and changing the angle for a slightly more beveled angle. And here's another example of bevel angles. Here's an older from 90s Lie-Nielsen low angle block plane, and the primary bevel here on the plane itself is, I believe, 12.5 degrees. And on this blade, which I just got from Lie-Nielsen, it's nice and sharp, there's a primary bevel angle of 25 degrees, and then I put a secondary honing bevel of 35 degrees using this jig over here. So that gives me an effective angle of 12.5 degrees and 35 degrees. So I'm basically working with a 47.5 degree angle when I'm tackling really hard woods like rosewood and ebony, and I planed some pecan yesterday and it worked really, really well. So this is the point I'm trying to emphasize in this video, is that primary honing angles might work, like if you just put it at 25 or 30 degrees, whichever one your blade came with, it might work really, really well for the wood that you're working. It may not work very well. So I encourage everyone out there to experiment and try different honing angles, again, depending on your blade, your material, and what your goal is. And here's another example of an older Lie-Nielsen low angle jack plane. And if you pull it out, it's kind of dirty. It has a primary bevel over here of 25 degrees, and then a secondary honing angle of 40 degrees. So basically I have 40, and I believe this is 12.5. So it's basically an effective cutting angle of 52.5 degrees. So it creates kind of more like a scraping action with a very, very thin shaving and a blade, which I like to use for really hard woods like the rosewood and the ebonies, which we use in instrument making. It's pretty dirty too. So just as an example of that, and here's a similar example on this blade, which is the Lie-Nielsen low angle, I think it's a smoothing plane, and it basically it's the same idea over here. And here's something a little different you may or may not have seen. It's a plane that I made from basically pecan and American hornbeam, and it's got a really high angle. The base over here has got an angle of about 50 degrees, and I use this for scraping, and it's basically an inexpensive Chinese blade, I believe, Rabbit brand, which I purchased off eBay, which has basic grinding level of about 30 degrees. The bevel is ground at 30 degrees, and then there's a secondary bevel that is used to put it on there at 35 degrees. And there's all kinds of examples like that. Here's a Lee Valley scraper blade, a very thick one. It's about 1/8 of an inch thick. And if you look closely, it has just a straight up 45 degree grinding angle, bevel angle. And then you pull over the angle at the top over here with a burnisher to create a scraping motion for scraping really hard woods. So this creates more of a scraping action. By the time you get to about 45 degrees, you'll be scraping more of your wood than actually planing it. And next up, I'm going to be discussing also grinding angles for chisels and carving chisels, which you use in instrument making. Like this skew chisel over here has a very, very steep bevel grind on both sides, which I use a very low angle, probably 15 to 20 degrees, leaning towards 15 degrees for really soft woods like pine, spruce, western red cedar, and a higher one, bevel angle, for hardwoods like oak, rosewood, and so on and so forth. And here's an inexpensive Chinese chisel, which I got a long time ago from Hartville Tulip, rehandled it, and it's got basically a primary bevel, and then it's just stropped of about 20 degrees. And I use this for cutting into hardwoods. And here's a double bevel skew, which has a really long bevel angle. And I use this for really fine shaving, and it's probably got about a 15 or 20 degree angle. And here are a couple of really old, I bought these in Vancouver about 48 years ago at Woodward's, and they've served me very well. They're very small, thin. One is about 4 millimeters, and the other is about 2.2 millimeter narrow carving chisels. And if you can see closely, I don't know if the camera can pick it up, they have a very long bevel, probably about 15 to 20 degrees on each one. And I use those for shaving very small amounts of wood from very tight corner areas. And here's a brand new Narix Cryogenic Chisel, which has a primary bevel angle, I believe, of, I think it comes with 25 degrees. And then if you look closely, I put on a secondary honing angle of 30 degrees. And I usually use this for as a general purpose chisel for cutting everything. So to recap, the purpose of honing another angle on top of your primary angle is to get a smoother, cleaner cut on your woods. And if you try it, you might try different woods. Different woods will react differently to different bevel angles. There's no kind of hard and fast rules unless you start experimenting and find what works with you. The other thing that you'll run into is the steels, and I wish I would have learned this when I went to woodworking school many, many years ago, is that again, different steels respond to different kinds of woods in different ways. Like there's a Lee Nielsen, and I have a really small plane that's made with A2 steel, and I believe that Lee Nielsen carries this as well as Lee Valley. And in my opinion, I've started using it, and I have never used it before, and I really, really like it because I find that the blade stays sharper for a lot longer, and I can get a really nice, very smooth, very fine cut in extremely hard woods. So if you have any comments, please write them down below. I'll be more than happy to respond. Or you can contact us at www.stringtown.biz. See you then.